Have you ever taken a photo and wondered why it's too dark, too blurry, or parts of the image are just completely out of focus? Well, in today's video, we're going to explain how to control all of that and how to be able to get you a much better looking photo by the end of it. By the end of this video, you're going to be a pro at being able to get the image exactly how you want it to be, both in exposure and in all the other effects we're going to talk about through the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle looks a little something like this. And at its core, it's quite simple. On each of the 3 points, we have ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Using those three, we can combine them in many different ways to achieve the proper lighting or exposure that we want to achieve. The problem becomes each of these have a special side effect, as I call it. And those side effects allow you to manipulate your images to do so much more than just expose them. So if you know how to control these, you're going to be able to take much better images. But there's more to it than just that. So let's just get into it. Let's start with aperture. What is it? And more importantly, what does it do? See, aperture works with shutter speed and ISO to determine the overall exposure of an image. And it does this using f-stops. If you've ever seen this image before, it's referring to aperture. Those blades are aperture blades, and the way it works is much like a human eye. The more open the aperture is, the more light gets let in. The more closed it is, the less light gets let in. Seems pretty simple, right? But nothing ever comes that easy. So the way this works is the more light that gets let in, the larger that aperture is. What happens is the f-stop is actually lower. So f2.8 is wider than f11. The easiest way to remember that is that it's a fraction, and any number over 2 is going to be larger than any number over 11, and that's exactly how aperture works. Now, arguably just as important as exposure is the secondary feature of aperture, and that's depth of field. Depth of field dictates how much of the image is in focus or out of focus. The larger the stop, so something like f2.8, the shallower that depth of field, the less of that image is in focus. And this is great so you can drive emphasis to a certain part of an image or really sort of create that front to back depth in an otherwise two-dimensional photo. In contrast, when we look at an image like this, you can see almost all of it is in focus, and that would mean we have a larger depth of field, and this is achieved using a narrower aperture. And that's what begs one of the largest questions ever. What happens if I need to let more light in, but I want the entire photo to be in focus? And the narrower that aperture is, the less light is being let in. And that leads us nicely to the second part of the exposure triangle, which is shutter speed. But before we get into shutter speed, if you're finding this video helpful, please do me a huge favor and consider subscribing down below. So that brings us to the second part of the exposure triangle, which is shutter speed. Shutter speed works with ISO and aperture to properly expose an image. And just like aperture, shutter speed uses fractions, at least for the most part anyways. Just like aperture, the larger the number, the more light gets let in. And since we're dealing in fractions, 1/50 lets in a lot more light than 1/250. But now for the more interesting part, and the part that really allows you to control your images, we're going to talk about its secondary feature. And the secondary feature of shutter speed is actually motion. And I know you're thinking, well, it's a photo. What kind of motion can you have in a photo? But that's how we can properly use blur to show motion in an image. For example, take a look at this. This is a long exposure, and it's set up in a way that you were meant to catch the light coming by on all the cars. And this shows cars driving by, on one side brake lights, on one side headlights. Now, since we had to let in the light for a really long period of time, as seen by the lights moving from front to back and back to front, this is done through a low shutter speed and a long exposure. Now, at the same time, if you're looking for a crisp photo, something that looks frozen in time, maybe a bird flying, but you want those wings ultra sharp, you want to go to a really, really fast shutter speed, something like 1/4000. And that's going to essentially have the light flicker just like that and allow you to be able to notice all the little details when you froze that image in time. So at this point, we can combine shutter speed and aperture to give us depth of field and motion, as well as exposure, which kind of lends itself to, what about ISO? It's kind of like the middle child of the exposure triangle. It's the forgotten one, it's the one that gets used the least, it's the one that's talked about the least, and there's sort of a reason for that. ISO uses numbers like 100, 800, 2000, all the way up to 64,000 plus. Now, just like the other two, the larger the number, the more light you're letting into the camera. But since this one's not a fraction, numbers like 2000 let in more light than 100. The weird thing about ISO is that it's doing this by changing the sensitivity of the actual sensor itself. And by doing that, its secondary feature is grain. Now, some people like grain in their images, some people don't like grain in their images, but almost all photographers want to add the grain themselves in post-production. So The common practice is to take your ISO and put it as low as you possibly can while allowing you to achieve the right depth of field and movement through shutter speed and aperture. So ISO is almost like the first thing you want to set up and keep it as low as possible, but also the last thing you want to bump up should you have to. If you take an image like this one here, you can sort of see the noise in the details, and it may not be that obvious on a screen or on this particular image, but it can be really obvious if you do shoot one at really, really high ISO. Now, when we look at an image that was taken at a really low ISO, you can see no noise, no artifacts, nothing in the image other than the smooth colors we were trying to capture. So what happens is if you want an image with a extremely narrow depth of field, but you want it to be as frozen as possible, then you're left with adjusting ISO. And so you try to get that to where you can, especially when you can't control the lighting, but there has to be a little bit of give because we can also reduce some of the noise in post-production. So you do have to kind of play around with that and get out there and take your photos to really know what you can and can't do. Different cameras are capable of keeping noise to a minimum at different ISOs. I've personally found Sony to be one of the best at keeping the noise low even at really high ISOs. I strongly recommend testing out your camera and getting to know the limits of that camera, both in ISO, shutter speed, aperture, daytime, nighttime, all of the possible situations you shoot in. And most of those we can't even make up on our own, they sort of just come with time. So the real key to all of this is understanding the theory, but really getting out there and putting it into practice. It's sort of like any sport. You can't just read about playing the sport and then expect to be the greatest without ever actually getting out there and trying to play the sport, and then practicing the sport, and then working on perfecting each skill within the sport. Photography is very much so like that, and people should treat it as such. It's not a topic that's overly fun or very interesting to learn about, but it's one of the ones that creates a good foundation for all the rest of your photography. So I hope you found this video helpful, and again, if you did, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. And we'll see you in the next video.